December 16th, 1944. Dawn broke cold and merciless across the Ardennes forest. The earth was frozen solid, the trees bare and skeletal, their branches crusted with ice. Snow crunched under the boots of German infantrymen as they moved silently toward American lines. These were battle-hardened soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, men who had endured the bitter cold of the Russian front, who thought they knew everything about artillery, cover, and survival. For hours, they had been advancing with grim determination. Their commanders had assured them that the surprise attack, Hitler's last gamble, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, would smash through weak American defenses and split the Allied armies in two. Victory was within reach. Antwerp, the vital port, would soon be back in German hands. The Reich would turn the tide of the war, but then it happened, something no German soldier had ever witnessed. The first American shells screamed overhead as they always did, the familiar whistling howl of death. The veterans dropped to the ground, just as they had done hundreds of times before. They knew the drill: hug the earth, find a ditch, a foxhole, or a tree trunk, and wait for the ground-shaking impact. But the shells didn't hit the ground. Instead, they detonated in the air. A split second before impact, the sky lit up with blinding flashes. Thunderous bursts cracked open above the treetops, raining down steel fragments at perfect killing height. It wasn't shrapnel from a ground blast, where the earth itself absorbed much of the fury. No, this was a cone of death that descended directly onto the men below. Veterans who had survived the merciless Soviet artillery in Russia were ripped apart in their foxholes. Men who thought they were safe under thick branches found themselves shredded by jagged steel raining from above. The very tactics they had relied upon, digging in, crouching low, offered no protection. Survivors later said it felt as if the sky itself had turned into a weapon. One German soldier, decades later, recalled in a memoir, "We were trained to fear artillery, but this was not artillery. It was something else. It was death from the heavens. No cover, no safety, no hope." The 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, outnumbered and barely holding on, watched in astonishment as German formations disintegrated before their eyes. Entire companies melted away in minutes, men falling where they stood, unable to comprehend what had struck them. And at the center of it all was one man, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group. Axelson was not supposed to use this weapon. The orders were crystal clear: do not fire proximity fuses at ground troops. The technology was too valuable, too secret. If the Germans captured even a single unexploded shell, they might reverse engineer it. The device was guarded as tightly as the atomic bomb, but Axelson was a soldier first. He saw the situation on the ground. His reconnaissance troops were being overrun. The conventional artillery wasn't enough. If he followed orders, he would lose his men. If he disobeyed, he might save them, but risk court-martial, disgrace, or worse. Axelson made his choice. "Load the proximity fuses," he ordered. His gunners hesitated. This was forbidden. But Axelson's voice was firm. "Do it. Fire." The result was what the Germans would later call Luftminenfeuer, a storm of aerial mines. To the Americans, it was the first battlefield use of the proximity fuse, and its effect was immediate and devastating. Within minutes, the German assault faltered. Commanders tried to regroup, but every movement forward triggered another storm of airbursts. Platoons vanished. Whole assault formations ceased to exist. What should have been an overwhelming push turned into chaos and retreat. The Battle of the Bulge had begun only hours earlier, yet already, at a small sector near Monchaux, history had shifted. The Germans had just encountered a weapon that rewrote the mathematics of war. But in that frozen morning, they didn't know it was technology. Miniature radar crammed inside a shell, detonating at the perfect height. All they knew was that something impossible had happened. Artillery that found them no matter where they hid. The men who survived stumbled back in shock, muttering to one another, "Die Amerikaner haben eine neue Waffe." The Americans have a new weapon. And deep inside the forest, Colonel Axelson stood by his guns, knowing he had crossed a line. He had disobeyed orders. He had risked everything. But as he looked at the broken German formations retreating into the snow, he also knew one truth. His decision had saved lives. This was just the beginning. The snow still fell lightly on the Ardennes that December morning, muffling sound, softening the brutal edges of war. But inside the American artillery positions near Monschau, there was nothing soft about the choices being made. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group stood among his men, his greatcoat dusted with frost, his face lined with exhaustion. For days he had watched the German build-up with growing unease. Reports had trickled in, patrols vanishing, strange movements in the woods, the uneasy silence before a storm. And now the storm had broken. The Battle of the Bulge was underway, and Axelson's sector was being hit first. The 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, barely more than a skeleton force, was holding the line against waves of German Volksgrenadiers. Axelson knew the math. The Americans were outnumbered 10-1. His artillery could fire conventional shells until the barrels glowed red, but it wouldn't be enough. The Germans would overrun them by sheer weight of numbers. In the back of his mind, one thought gnawed at him. The crates stacked under guard, marked with red stenciled warnings. Restricted ordnance, proximity fuses. They had been delivered under secrecy, with instructions as strict as any in the army. The message from higher command had been blunt. These are not to be used against ground troops under any circumstances. The reasoning was sound, at least on paper. The proximity fuse was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, second only to the atomic bomb. If even one unexploded shell fell into German hands, the enemy's scientists might uncover its mysteries. A captured fuse could undo years of work by America's finest physicists, could tip the balance of the skies if adapted for anti-aircraft use. But to Axelson, that was theory. What he faced was reality. His men were dying, the Germans were advancing, and conventional artillery wasn't stopping them. He gathered his battery commanders. The wind cut through their heavy coats as they huddled around a field map spread across the hood of a jeep. The sounds of battle, rifle cracks, machine gun bursts, the muffled thump of mortars echoed through the trees. "Sir," one officer said, pointing at the German formations moving through the woods, "they'll break through within the hour." Axelson looked at the crates again, as if weighing their contents in his mind. Inside each shell was a miracle of engineering. A miniature radar system, small enough to fit in the nose of a projectile, strong enough to survive the 20,000 Gs of being fired from a cannon, and smart enough to detonate at just the right moment. Every briefing, every order he had ever received told him these were not his to use. But in that frozen dawn, those orders felt like a death sentence, for his men and for the thin American line in front of him. He hesitated only a moment, then he made the choice that would alter the course of the battle. "Load the proximity fuses," he said quietly but firmly. The officers froze. One of them swallowed hard. "Sir, that's against orders." "I know," Axelson replied. His eyes never left the map. "But orders won't save us today. Those fuses will." There was no more debate. The men saluted, turned, and barked the command down the line. Within minutes, crews were hauling out the forbidden shells, slamming them into howitzers, ramming powder bags into breeches. The first rounds fired arced into the winter sky. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary. The roar of the gun, the recoil rocking the carriage, the smoke drifting over the snow. But then came the detonation, not on the ground, not in the trees, but in the air. Axelson watched through binoculars as German formations crumpled under the unexpected storm. Soldiers who thought themselves safe in foxholes were shredded where they lay. Those hiding behind logs or crouched in ditches were cut down by fragments raining from above. The battlefield changed in an instant. from ordered German advances to chaos, confusion, and retreat. The colonel lowered his binoculars slowly. Around him, his gunners stared in awe at what they had just unleashed. For a moment, the only sound was the echo of the blasts rolling across the frozen hills. Then one young gunner muttered under his breath, "My God, it's like the hand of heaven itself." Axelson said nothing. He knew what he had done. He had broken the rules, violated direct orders, risked his career, perhaps even his freedom. But as he looked at the stunned German survivors stumbling back into the trees, he also knew the truth. He had saved his men. He had bought time. And in war, time was life. What Axelson could not know was that this act of defiance would ripple far beyond his artillery group. Within days, reports of the weapon's devastating effect would reach Eisenhower himself, and the strict rules about the proximity fuse would be torn up. For now, though, on that bitter December morning, Axelson carried the weight of his decision alone. The war had just entered a new phase, and it was he who had lit the fuse. As German troops staggered back from the killing fields around Monschau, bewildered and broken, they had no way of knowing what had struck them. To them, it was sorcery. To the Americans firing those guns, it was the unveiling of one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, the proximity fuse. From the outside, the shell looked ordinary, just another steel casing packed with explosives. But in its nose was a device no bigger than a coffee can, a tiny marvel of electronics that defied the imagination. Inside were more than 130 individual components, miniature vacuum tubes, coils of fine wire, resistors, capacitors, all assembled with a precision that seemed almost impossible in 1944. What it amounted to was this, a shell that could see. The principle was deceptively simple. Each fuse carried a tiny radar transmitter that sent out radio waves during flight. When those waves bounced back from the ground, a tree, or, most importantly, a formation of men, the circuit recognized the change in frequency and triggered the detonation. It was automatic, instantaneous, and terrifyingly accurate. Instead of exploding harmlessly into the dirt or going off too high above the treetops, the shell now burst at precisely the right height to maximize its killing power. That height, between 30 and 50 feet above the ground, was the sweet spot where jagged steel fragments could cut down anyone below. But what made the proximity fuse truly astonishing wasn't just what it did. It was how it came to exist in the first place. The story began not on the battlefields of Europe, but in a most unlikely place, a converted car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. Behind its unremarkable facade was the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, the cradle of one of the most extraordinary wartime inventions in history. It was here that Dr. Merle Tuve, a soft-spoken physicist with a mind like a steel trap, gathered some of America's finest scientific talent. Under his leadership, the lab employed nearly 3% of the nation's physicists, a staggering concentration of brain power. The secrecy around their work rivaled that of the Manhattan Project. Guards watched the entrances. Employees carried identification at all times, and conversations about the project were forbidden even at home. The challenge Tuve and his team faced was immense. Ordinary vacuum tubes, the glass cylinders that powered radios in American living rooms, shattered under the incredible forces of artillery fire. Imagine being slammed with a pressure 20,000 times greater than gravity, spun at thousands of revolutions per second, all while surviving freezing cold, scorching heat, and the violence of recoil. That was what a shell endured every time it was fired. To make a fuse that could live through that was, many believed, impossible. But American science was nothing if not stubborn. One by one, obstacles were overcome. New types of vacuum tubes were developed, so small they were no bigger than the tip of a pencil. Yet inside each was the same complexity as the tubes found in a home radio. A special battery was invented that came to life only after firing, when the shock of being launched crushed a tiny glass vial, mixing chemicals that created instant power. Bit by bit, the impossible became reality. By 1944, American factories were turning out 40,000 of these fuses every single day. Over 100 companies were involved, giants like RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, each contributing parts, materials, or labor. The cost of the program reached $1 billion in 1940s money, second only to the atomic bomb itself. And yet, outside a handful of senior commanders, hardly anyone in the US Army knew the details. Gunners were trained only to follow orders, never to question how the shells worked. The risk of one falling into enemy hands was too great. That was why the restrictions were so severe, why Axelson's order to use them against ground troops had been such an act of defiance. The Germans, for their part, were left utterly in the dark. Their scientists were capable men, but the sheer scale of miniaturization required for the fuse was beyond their wartime industry. Even if they had captured one, replicating it under Allied bombing would have been nearly impossible. On that December morning, though, none of this mattered to the men in the snow. To the Germans who faced the storm, it was black magic. To the Americans who pulled the lanyards, it was salvation. The secret had been unleashed, and soon word of what had happened at Monschau would spread, not just among the terrified survivors retreating through the Ardennes, but all the way up to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The proximity fuse had stepped out of the shadows. The only question now was whether Eisenhower himself would dare to break the rules and authorize its use across the entire battlefield. The answer to that question would come soon. Long before the proximity fuse lit up the skies of the Ardennes, its story began in quiet laboratories, in chalk-dusted classrooms, and in the restless minds of American scientists who understood that the coming war would not be won by muscle or bravery alone, but by technology. At the heart of it was Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist whose name would never be as famous as Oppenheimer or Einstein, but whose contribution was every bit as vital to victory. Tuve wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a general, he was a man of equations, circuits, and radio waves. But in the dark days of 1940, as German bombers pounded London and Hitler's armies stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, Tuve realized that America needed a weapon no one else dared dream of. The idea was radical. A fuse that could think. A fuse that could decide the perfect moment to explode, not by clockwork timing or mechanical guesswork, but by sensing its surroundings. To soldiers accustomed to pulling lanyards and cranking dials, it sounded like science fiction. To Tuve, it was physics. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. He began pulling together a team at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. The location was almost comical, a defunct car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. But Tuve's team attacked each problem with relentless ingenuity. They invented shock-resistant tubes, batteries that activated only upon firing, and circuits that adjusted automatically to prevent premature explosions. And they weren't working in isolation. America's industrial giants threw their weight behind the effort. RCA, General Electric, Westinghouse, Sylvania. Over 100 companies contributed. Engineers, machinists, and factory workers became as important as generals and admirals. A young woman riveting a tiny circuit board in a Midwestern plant was as much a soldier as the GI crawling through the snow in Belgium. The numbers told the story. By late 1944, America was producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. Think about that. 40,000 pieces of delicate, hand-built electronics, hardened to survive artillery fire, rolling off assembly lines at the pace of ammunition. By the end of the war, more than 9 million had been manufactured. The cost was staggering, $1 billion in 1940s money. The second most expensive project of the war, exceeded only by the Manhattan Project itself. Yet no one who saw the results doubted the value. Commanders would later say the fuse increased the effectiveness of artillery fire by a factor of 5 to 10. In practical terms, that meant one American battery could do the work of an entire regiment. Secrecy was absolute. The program was classified at the highest level. Workers couldn't discuss their jobs even with spouses. Each fuse was stamped with a serial number, tracked from factory floor to battlefield to ensure not one went missing. Guards patrolled storage depots like they were guarding treasure, because, in truth, they were. For Germany, this kind of scientific industrial mobilization was unthinkable. The Reich had brilliant scientists, men like Werner Heisenberg and Werner von Braun, but they lacked the factories, the manpower, the resources to mass-produce such miracles. Nazi ideology itself got in the way. Hitler's regime distrusted anything it didn't invent first. In their arrogance, they dismissed American industry as clumsy and undisciplined. They would pay dearly for that mistake. Because what happened in those secret labs and sprawling factories wasn't just the creation of a new fuse. It was the beginning of a revolution. The miniaturization techniques pioneered for the proximity fuse would later shape the birth of modern electronics, paving the way for transistors, computers, and the space age. But in December of 1944, all of that was still in the future. For now, the fuse was a weapon about to be tested on the bloodiest battlefield the U.S. Army would ever face. The first reports from Monschau were already on their way up the chain of command. Eisenhower and his generals would soon hear the astonishing news. German attacks shattered by artillery fire, unlike anything seen before. The question was no longer whether the proximity fuse worked. The question was whether America dared to unleash it everywhere and risk the secret falling into enemy hands. The fate of the Ardennes, and perhaps of the war itself, hung in the balance. The Ardennes forest had always been a place of ghosts, dark, silent, forbidding. But in December 1944, it became something far worse, a graveyard. For the men of the German 326th Volksgrenadier Division, who had marched into the fog-shrouded woods with confidence, the first encounter with the proximity fuse was nothing short of a nightmare. They were veterans, many pulled from the ruins of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal fighting against the Red Army. They knew how to survive artillery. They knew when to hug the earth, when to scatter, when to trust the cover of the trees. But none of that mattered now. When Axelson's guns opened fire near Monschau, the Germans did what they had always done. They dropped into foxholes, pressed themselves against frozen dirt, clutched their rifles to their chests, and waited for the ground to erupt. Instead, the explosions came from above. One survivor recalled later, "We thought we were safe. Then the air itself burst open. There was no protection. The sky was killing us." Shell after shell burst 30 to 50 feet overhead, each detonation sending a cone of jagged steel raining down in every direction. Men were shredded where they crouched, helmets split like tin cans. Even those who dug deep into the snow and earth found that shrapnel had a way of seeking them out. An entire German company, nearly 100 men, was reduced to silence in less than 5 minutes. Officers tried to rally their troops, shouting for them to advance, but their voices were drowned out by the relentless thunder overhead. Platoons broke apart, scattering into the trees, discipline dissolving in panic. What struck the survivors most was not just the lethality, but the precision. Conventional artillery had a rhythm. A man could sometimes sense where the shells would land, could gamble on which patches of earth might be spared. But with proximity fuses, there was no pattern, no safety, no mercy. The Americans no longer needed perfect aim. The fuse itself found the target. Prisoners captured later that day spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen. One sergeant told his interrogators, "We could not hide. We could not run. It was as if every shell knew where we were." Another soldier, trembling, simply muttered, "Die Amerikaner haben die Luft vermint." The Americans have mined the air. Even German officers, men who prided themselves on discipline and rationality, struggled to explain it. Their artillery manuals were suddenly useless. The tactics drilled into them on the parade grounds of Bavaria and Prussia offered no defense. As one lieutenant wrote in his diary, later recovered from his frozen body, "This is not artillery, it is witchcraft." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Entire units lost cohesion before even reaching American lines. Soldiers abandoned attacks, fleeing back through the woods in disorder, convinced they were facing some new, inhuman terror. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The Americans had a weapon that turned the very sky into a trap. For the US troops holding the line, the effect was equally shocking, but in the opposite way. Cavalry troopers who had braced themselves for slaughter suddenly found the German assaults melting away before they could even close the distance. Forward observers reported that whole formations simply disappeared under the storm. "Sir," one young officer radioed back, his voice trembling with awe, "they're just gone." At higher command posts, the first reports caused confusion. How could a handful of American guns halt an entire German regiment? But as the accounts multiplied, it became clear. Colonel Axelson's decision to break the rules had changed the battle. Still, no one knew how far the effect might spread. Monschau was only one sector of a massive German offensive stretching across 85 miles of front. If the fuse worked there, could it work everywhere? Eisenhower would soon have to decide. But for now, in the frozen fields of the Ardennes, the verdict was already in. The Germans had learned the hard way that their old tricks, the foxholes, the trenches, the discipline of seasoned veterans, meant nothing against a shell that exploded in mid-air. For the first time, they faced artillery that hunted them from above. And in that moment, the myth of German invincibility cracked. The Ardennes offensive was far from over, but the seeds of its failure had just been planted in blood and snow. At the sharp edge of the Ardennes, Colonel Axelson's defiance had already saved lives and shattered German assaults. But in the warmth of command bunkers far behind the lines, his decision sparked a different kind of explosion, one of politics, secrecy, and command authority. For months, the rule had been absolute. Proximity fuses were to be used only for anti-aircraft fire, not against tanks, not against infantry, not against anything that might leave behind a shell the enemy could recover. The fear of compromise was very real. If Germany ever got its hands on this technology, Allied bombers over the Reich might find themselves under skies filled with equally deadly flak. So when reports trickled in from Monschau that morning, German assaults broken apart by American artillery fire more effective than anything previously seen, there was both excitement and alarm. "What the hell are they talking about?" one general is said to have barked when the first messages arrived. No shell does that, but as confirmations multiplied, the picture became clear. Colonel Axelson had crossed the line. He had fired the forbidden shells, and the results were undeniable. The news rose quickly through the chain of command, all the way to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, now faced a decision as momentous as any in his career. On one side was the standing order: protect the secret at all costs. On the other was the reality. The German offensive was punching deep into the Ardennes, threatening to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and perhaps prolong the war by months, even years. Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders. The maps of the Ardennes lay spread across the table, marked with thick red arrows showing the German advance. Patton's Third Army was swinging north. Montgomery was holding on in the north, and the 101st Airborne was encircled at Bastogne. Every reserve was already committed. The Germans had achieved surprise. They had momentum, and only something extraordinary could halt them. Eisenhower understood the stakes. He had built his reputation not just on strategy, but on pragmatism. He knew wars weren't won by clinging to rules. They were won by seizing opportunities. On December 19, 1944, he made his choice. He formally requested permission from Washington to release the proximity fuse for full ground combat use. The response was swift. 3 days later, on December 21st, the restrictions were lifted. The weapon that had been locked away in secrecy was now in the hands of every American artillery unit in the Ardennes. Distribution was immediate. Truck convoys rolled through the snow, carrying crates of the precious shells to forward batteries. Soldiers who had never even heard of the fuse suddenly found themselves handling rounds that seemed alive, rounds that didn't just explode, they hunted. Within days, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne had their share. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion loaded them into their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit fighting with grit and determination, began to unleash them on German positions southwest of the town. Each unit quickly learned what Axelson already knew. Proximity fuses turned artillery from a blunt instrument into a scalpel of death. Forward observers no longer needed to adjust fire endlessly. They could call in barrages with confidence, knowing the shells would find their own perfect detonation height. Instead of needing pinpoint accuracy, American gunners simply blanketed an area, letting the technology do the rest. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and overwhelming. German assault formations, once so disciplined and lethal, now dissolved under fire. Commanders reported that entire attacks melted away before they even reached American lines. Prisoners admitted that morale plummeted as soon as the first air bursts began. Eisenhower had gambled, and he had won. The decision to release the proximity fuse didn't just save Bastogne. It didn't just blunt the German offensive. It transformed the artillery arm of the U.S. and Army overnight. What had once been a supporting weapon now became decisive, capable of stopping entire divisions in their tracks. Years later, military historians would rank Eisenhower's choice alongside the great strategic decisions of the war. The D-Day landings, the push across France, the coordination of Allied armies. For while it was Axelson who had fired the first forbidden shells, it was Eisenhower who unleashed the storm. And in the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, the storm was only just beginning. The small Belgian town of Bastogne was little more than a crossroads, a cluster of stone houses, a church, and a few narrow streets. Yet in December 1944, it became the focal point of the entire German offensive. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the arteries of the Ardennes, and Hitler wanted it. The Americans knew it too. That's why, when the German tide surged west, the 101st Airborne Division was rushed into the town. These were the men of D-Day, the paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy, fought through Holland, and now found themselves cut off, surrounded, and outnumbered 5-1. By December 20th, Bastogne was encircled. Snowdrifts piled high in the fields. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Supplies ran dangerously low. The men had no winter clothing, little food, and dwindling ammunition. German loudspeakers blared surrender demands into the night, promising annihilation if the town did not capitulate. But the 101st Airborne wasn't about to quit, and standing beside them in the frozen fields just beyond the town were the gunners of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. Armed with 75mm pack howitzers, the 463rd had little reason to expect they could stop entire German divisions. Their guns were light, designed to be dropped by parachute, not to withstand a full-scale siege. But what they did have now, thanks to Eisenhower's decision, were proximity fuses. Between December 19th and December 31st, the battalion fired exactly 7,676 rounds. Not all were fitted with the new fuses. Supplies were still limited, but enough were to make the difference between survival and destruction. On December 22nd, German envoys approached the town under a white flag. They carried a typed message demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, read it, chuckled, and scribbled a single word in reply: nuts. The answer was defiant, almost humorous, but behind the humor was grim reality. The Germans were preparing for a massive assault. When it came, the proximity fuses sang. German infantry advanced across the snow, gray-clad figures moving in disciplined waves. Normally, such formations could withstand artillery by spreading out, by trusting to the folds of the land and the cover of the woods. But not this time. Shells burst in the air with perfect timing, their fragments sweeping across the open fields like invisible scythes. Platoons vanished in seconds. Entire companies went to ground, only to be cut apart in their foxholes as the sky itself erupted above them. Survivors stumbled backward, leaving trails of dark stains in the white snow. For the men of the 101st, huddled in Bastogna's frozen cellars, the sound of those airbursts was salvation. It was like thunder that answered our prayers, one paratrooper later recalled. The shells didn't just stop them, they tore them apart. And the 463rd wasn't alone. To the northwest, the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion rolled their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers into position and joined the chorus. To the southwest, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black unit often overlooked in the history books, fired their 155mm guns with devastating effect. Their shells, detonating 50 feet above the ground, created rings of fire and steel that no German force could penetrate. Captured prisoners spoke of the terror. "We could not breathe without the sky exploding," one said. Another admitted that entire attacks disintegrated before reaching American lines, men breaking and running before they had even fired a shot. Inside Bastogne, morale soared. Supplies were short, the cold unrelenting, but the men knew they were holding on. Each time German troops massed for an assault, the proximity fuse broke them apart. Each time the enemy thought they had the Americans cornered, the artillery reminded them otherwise. The siege dragged on, day after frozen day. McAuliffe's nuts reply became a rallying cry, repeated with pride by paratroopers and artillerymen alike. And behind that bravado was the hard, grinding fact. Without the fuse, Bastogne might well have fallen. With it, the town held. On December 26th, tanks of Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and reached the town, relieving the defenders. Bastogne had survived, and in surviving, it had denied Hitler his prize, bought precious time for the Allies, and set the stage for the German offensive to collapse. Later, when historians asked veterans of Bastogne how they had endured, many gave the same answer: grit, stubbornness, and the proximity fuse. The weapon had proven itself, not in theory, not in laboratories, but in the snow and blood of the Ardennes, and it was about to prove itself again, in battles even more terrifying than Bastogne. The story of Bastogne is usually told through the eyes of the 101st Airborne, young paratroopers in foxholes, their breath steaming in the frozen air, their rifles clutched tight. But beyond the town's perimeter, in the snow-dusted fields and woods, another group of Americans was writing its own chapter of courage. They wore the same uniforms, carried the same flag on their sleeves, but they fought under a shadow, the shadow of segregation. They were the men of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes. In December 1944, as the German noose tightened around Bastogne, the 969th rolled its 155mm howitzers into position. These were massive guns, far larger than the pack howitzers of the 463rd. Each shell weighed nearly 100 pounds, each blast echoing across the frozen countryside like a thunderclap. And now, thanks to Eisenhower's order, those shells carried proximity fuses. The effect was nothing short of apocalyptic. German troops advancing through the snow suddenly found themselves beneath explosions that seemed to hang in the air before erupting with terrifying precision. Fragments rained down like steel hail, scything through ranks of infantry, shattering vehicles, ripping apart machine gun nests. A single barrage from the 969th could tear open entire formations. One after-action report described the effect as a ring of death encircling Bastogne. Another officer put it more simply: they could not get through. The 969th made sure of that. Yet, for the men pulling the lanyards, it was more than just a technical triumph. It was vindication. African-American soldiers had long been relegated to support roles: drivers, laborers, cooks. Few were given the chance to fight, let alone to command artillery on the front line of the biggest battle of the war. In the 969th, they proved beyond all doubt that courage and skill knew no color. They endured the same cold, the same hunger, the same relentless shelling from German guns. They dug their positions out of frozen ground, manhandled their heavy shells through snow and ice, and kept firing when exhaustion pressed down like lead. One veteran of the battalion later recalled, "We knew some people didn't expect much from us. That only made us more determined. Every time we fired, we were fighting two battles, one against the Germans and one against doubt." Their contribution was not lost on those who fought beside them. Paratroopers of the 101st, hardened and weary, spoke with respect of the artillery that shielded their positions. Forward observers praised the accuracy, the speed, the sheer volume of fire. When the 969th opened up, one paratrooper said, "You felt 10 feet taller." Captured Germans, too, took note. Prisoners later admitted that American artillery was their greatest fear in the Bulge, and the 155s with proximity fuses were the worst of all. "We could not move," one POW said. The air itself was filled with knives, but the recognition didn't always follow. After the war, the exploits of the 969th were often overlooked, overshadowed by the more famous divisions. For decades, their story was told only in fragments, tucked away in after-action reports and fading memories. And yet, in December 1944, their impact was undeniable. They held the line. They broke German assaults. They saved lives. When Patton's tanks finally punched through to Bastogne on December 26th, the paratroopers who had endured the siege emerged to cheers and handshakes. But just outside town, the men of the 969th kept their guns trained on the horizon, still firing, still holding. History may have placed them in the shadows, but on that frozen battlefield, the proximity fuse gave them a spotlight they had earned 100 times over. And in the brutal days to come, as the fighting shifted toward the Sauer River, the fuse would once again prove itself, not just as a weapon of war, but as a force of terror for the German army. Christmas Day, 1944. While families back home in America gathered around trees lit with tinsel and candles, while children unwrapped gifts in warm living rooms, the men of Patton's Third Army were locked in a bitter struggle across the icy waters of the Sauer River. The weather was bone-deep cold. The river ran dark and sluggish, its banks crusted with ice, its surface glazed in places with thin sheets that cracked beneath boots. For the Germans, the Sauer represented an opportunity, a crossing point to push deeper into Luxembourg and throw back the advancing Americans. For Patton's men, it was a line that had to be held at all costs. On the night of December 25th, German infantry began massing along the far bank. They were determined, experienced troops, grenadiers and engineers trained in river assaults. They carried rafts, planks, and bridging equipment. To their commanders, the Sauer crossing looked like a chance to claw back momentum. But waiting for them on the near bank were American forward observers, radios crackling in the dark. And behind those observers, hidden in the woods and fields, were the guns of the U.S. artillery, guns now loaded with proximity fuses. As the Germans launched their attack, the scene turned to horror. At first, the assault seemed orderly. Rafts shoved off into the current, paddles cutting through the black water, men huddled low against the freezing wind. Others picked their way across half-frozen fords, rifles held above their heads. Officers barked orders, trying to keep formations tight. Then the American fire began. Shells arced overhead and detonated in mid-air, bursting into cones of flame and steel above the river itself. The effect was catastrophic. Shrapnel tore into packed rafts, splintering wood, cutting men to ribbons. Entire boats vanished in flashes of white light, their occupants spilling into the icy water, thrashing, screaming, and disappearing beneath the current. Those who tried to crawl along the banks fared no better. The airbursts struck them in the open, shredding groups of men before they could even reach the river's edge. The night sky lit with stuttering flashes, each one followed by a rain of screams. A forward observer later wrote, It was slaughter. They had no cover, no chance. The river itself became a killing ground. Patton himself, pushing north with his armored columns, came to witness the aftermath. He was no stranger to battle, no stranger to carnage, yet even he was shaken. The accuracy was uncanny, he remarked. They were being cut down as if by the hand of God. The numbers were staggering. Entire German battalions were destroyed in hours. Survivors who stumbled back to their lines were frostbitten, bloodied, and broken in spirit. Prisoners taken afterward confessed that they had never faced such a weapon. The sky was mined, one whispered. Another muttered that it was worse than Stalingrad. At least there, you could hide in the rubble. The Sauer River became a graveyard. The bodies of men and the wreckage of shattered rafts clogged its waters for days afterward. Ice formed around them, sealing the horror in frozen silence. For the Americans, the victory was decisive. The German attack was crushed before it could gain traction, and the Third Army's advance continued. But for those who watched it unfold, the memory of that night was seared into their minds. One GI put it simply: it wasn't war, it was annihilation. The proximity fuse had shown its full power. Not just at Monschau, not just at Bastogne, but here, on a frozen river in Luxembourg, where an entire German assault was wiped out before it had even begun. For the Wehrmacht, the lesson was clear. The old ways of fighting, mass assaults, close formations, reliance on cover, no longer worked. Against this new American weapon, the sky itself was the enemy. And for the Allies, the lesson was just as clear. The fuse had become not just a secret tool, but a decisive arm of victory. As the snow settled over the silent riverbanks, the Ardennes offensive staggered toward its end. The Germans had gambled everything, but now, with the proximity fuse unleashed, the tide was turning. For the German soldier in the Ardennes, the winter of 1944 was already a test of endurance. Frozen rations, inadequate clothing, and the grinding pressure of a last, desperate offensive. But when the proximity fuse arrived on the battlefield, the psychological toll became unbearable. Captured prisoners gave testimony that chilled Allied interrogators. These were not men easily rattled. Many had fought since 1939, from the fields of France to the ruins of Stalingrad. They had endured British bombers, Soviet artillery, and American air power. Yet when asked what broke their spirit in the Ardennes, their answers were remarkably consistent. It was the artillery that exploded in the air. One prisoner, a veteran sergeant from the Eastern Front, put it bluntly: "We knew artillery. We knew how to survive it. But this we could not survive. It followed us everywhere. The foxhole, the trench, even the trees. Nothing could protect us." Another, a young corporal taken near Bastogne, said he thought the Americans had harnessed some new science beyond human comprehension. "The shells knew where we were. They chose the right moment to burst. We had no chance." To Allied intelligence officers, these words confirmed what the men on the ground already knew. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of fear. It stripped away the soldier's most basic comfort, the belief that cover could keep him safe. One particularly haunting account came from a lieutenant captured at the Sauer River. Shivering, frostbitten, and hollow-eyed, he described the attack in a voice barely above a whisper. "We marched as we had always marched. We crossed as we had been trained to cross. And then the sky opened. It was like walking into an invisible wall of knives. We fell, one after another, as if the air itself had turned against us." Even German officers, men steeped in discipline and tradition, found themselves unable to rally their troops once the first proximity-fused shells exploded overhead. A field commander wrote in his diary, later recovered from his body, that the men were losing faith, not just in their weapons, but in war itself. "What use is courage," he scribbled, "when the air itself kills?" Psychological warfare had always been part of battle. The shriek of the Stuka dive bomber, the roar of the Katyusha rocket, the thunder of heavy artillery, all were designed to terrify as much as to kill. But the proximity fuse went beyond terror. It struck at the foundation of a soldier's training. It said, "Nothing you do will save you." Allied interrogators noted a striking detail. Prisoners no longer spoke of tactics, of plans, of maneuvers. Instead, they spoke of inevitability. "It is hopeless," one said flatly. "Your shells find us everywhere." The morale effect rippled through entire units. Reports reached Allied lines of German platoons refusing to advance, of men scattering at the first whistle of incoming rounds. Discipline, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was collapsing under the weight of an invisible weapon. For the Americans listening to these stories, there was a sense of grim satisfaction. Years of fighting had taught them to respect the German soldier, his toughness, his training, his discipline. To hear that even these hardened men were undone by the proximity fuse confirmed what they had already witnessed on the battlefield. The balance had shifted. Yet there was also an unease. War was brutal, but it had always been a contest of skill and endurance. Now it felt like something else, like science itself had tipped the scales. One American officer, after reading a captured diary, remarked quietly, "For the first time, I almost pitied them." But pity was a luxury few could afford in December 1944. The Ardennes was still ablaze with battle. The Germans were not finished, and every day brought new assaults. The proximity fuse had given the Allies an edge, but the fighting was far from over. Still, one truth was becoming inescapable. For the German soldier in the Ardennes, the war had changed forever. The trenches, the foxholes, the carefully learned tricks of survival, all had been rendered useless by a weapon that seemed to strip away the very rules of battle. And as the smoke cleared, the question lingered. If the proximity fuse could do this to men on the battlefield, what would it mean for the future of warfare itself? By the first week of January 1945, the great German gamble in the Ardennes was failing. What had begun with thunderous assaults, 200,000 men, and Hitler's desperate hope of splitting the Allies was now unraveling in snow, fire, and blood. And at the heart of that unraveling was artillery. American artillery transformed by the proximity fuse. It wasn't just the terrifying explosions over foxholes or the slaughter at the Sauer River. It was the way the fuse magnified every other element of American strength. For the first time, the U.S. Army had a weapon that didn't just support the fight, it often decided it outright. Take Bastogne. Without the fuse, the 101st Airborne might not have held. With it, the town became an unbreakable fortress. Take Patton's Third Army. Their rapid drive north was protected at every step by artillery barrages that shredded counterattacks before they began. Even the skies benefited. Anti-aircraft batteries, fitted with proximity fuses, brought down German planes in droves. Pilots who once counted on speed and altitude found themselves hunted by shells that seemed to know where they were. One Luftwaffe ace admitted after the war that American flak had become suicidal to fly through. The fuse was part of something larger, a triangle of destruction that the Germans could not match. At one corner stood American tanks, churning forward with mechanical reliability. At another, American aircraft dominating the skies whenever the weather cleared. And now, completing the triangle, stood American artillery, no longer just the king of battle, but the executioner of armies. The numbers told the story. Analysts later estimated that the fuse increased artillery effectiveness 5 to 10-fold. One American battery, with the fuse, could deliver the same destructive power as an entire regiment firing conventional shells. That multiplier effect rippled across the front, stretching American firepower far beyond what the Germans could counter. But perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. By early January, German commanders reported that their troops were refusing to mass for attacks. Fear of the air mines made coordination almost impossible. Assaults broke apart before they even reached the line. A German general later admitted that the proximity fuse had robbed him of his most basic tool, the ability to control his men under fire. For the Allies, This was confirmation of something they had long believed, that war in the modern age would not be won by numbers alone, but by science, industry, and organization. America had harnessed its factories and universities to produce miracles, and those miracles were now reshaping the battlefield. The Manhattan Project would ultimately overshadow the proximity fuse in history, but in the winter of 1944, it was the fuse that saved lives. One senior commander later wrote, "Without it, the outcome of the Bulge might have been very different. With it, we held the line." And yet, beyond the battle, the fuse pointed to something larger. It showed that electronics, the world of circuits, tubes, and invisible signals, had entered warfare to stay. From this seed would grow radar-guided bombs, heat-seeking missiles, and eventually the digital age itself. The Germans never caught up. Their scientists, brilliant though they were, could not match the scale of American production or the coordination of so many industries. In their arrogance, they underestimated what democracy and free enterprise could produce when pushed to the limit. The result was written in the Ardennes snow. Broken columns of German armor, shattered formations of infantry, and skies ruled by American guns. For the U.S. Army, the proximity fuse became a symbol, not just of victory, but of what made that victory possible. Courage, yes. Grit, yes. But also something else, the marriage of science and soldiering, of university chalkboards and muddy foxholes, of factory floors and frozen gun pits. In January 1945, as the last embers of the German offensive died out, the men who had fought in the Bulge knew one thing for certain: the war was not over. Fierce battles still lay ahead, from the Siegfried Line to the Rhine, from the plains of Germany to the heart of Berlin. But they also knew this: the balance had shifted. The German war machine had thrown its last dice, and America's artillery, armed with a secret born of radar waves and glass tubes, had helped break it. The king of battle had become something more: the hand of destiny. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the world tried to take stock of what had just happened. Cities lay in ruins, nations were shattered, and tens of millions were dead. The war had been a conflict of men and machines, of courage and cruelty, but also of science. In the headlines, the atomic bomb would claim the spotlight. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would sear themselves into the memory of mankind. But for the men who had fought in the Ardennes, another invention stood out just as vividly: the proximity fuse. By the end of the war, over 9 million fuses had been produced. More than $1 billion had been spent, an astronomical figure for the 1940s, second only to the Manhattan Project itself. And the return on that investment had been written on the battlefield. Shattered German formations, broken Luftwaffe squadrons, and American lives saved. General George S. Patton, never a man to mince words, called it simply the most important new development in the war. Admiral Lewis Strauss went further. It won the Battle of the Bulge for us. But the fuse's legacy went beyond victory in Europe. It signaled the dawn of a new age, an age when warfare would no longer be decided just by numbers of men or weight of steel, but by circuits, signals, and electronics. The same principles that guided a fuse to explode at the right height would soon guide missiles to their targets, satellites to their orbits, and computers to their calculations. For the scientists who had labored in secrecy at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the end of the war brought a new mission. Freed from wartime urgency, they carried their knowledge into the post-war boom. Miniaturization, once driven by the need to fit radar into the nose of a shell, became the seedbed of the transistor and eventually the microchip. In a quiet, indirect way, the proximity fuse helped lay the foundation for the modern world. For the soldiers who had pulled the lanyards in the Ardennes, the memory was more personal. They remembered the icy gun pits, the endless nights of firing, the stunned expressions of captured Germans who could not comprehend what had hit them. They remembered the relief on the faces of paratroopers at Bastogne when the sky lit up with protective bursts. And they remembered that for once it was the Germans, not them, who trembled in the foxholes. The fuse became a reminder of what America could accomplish when science, industry, and courage worked together. Universities, factories, generals, and ordinary GIs had all played a part. And together, they had taken an idea that once seemed impossible and turned it into a weapon that changed history. Today, when we look back at the Battle of the Bulge, we see the drama of Bastogne, the grit of the 101st, the audacity of Patton, and the sheer desperation of Hitler's last gamble. But woven into all of that is the quieter, subtler story of a small device in the nose of a shell, a device that multiplied American firepower, crushed German assaults, and helped end the greatest war the world has ever known. In the end, the proximity fuse wasn't just about technology. It was about survival. It was about giving young Americans a fighting chance in the frozen woods of Belgium. It was about taking the fear of artillery, a fear every soldier knew, and turning it back on the enemy. And perhaps, most of all, it was about hope. Hope that science could serve humanity not only in war, but in peace. Hope that the same ingenuity that created weapons could one day build a safer world. As veterans of the Ardennes grew old, they told their children and grandchildren about the winter of 1944. About the snow, the cold, the encirclement, the fear, and about the strange new shells that saved them. Some called it the fuse that won the battle. Others called it the invention that shortened the war. But to those who were there, it had a simpler name: salvation. And now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think? Was the proximity fuse the most important secret weapon of World War II, or do you think another invention deserves that title? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps us out. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next untold tale from the Second World War. We have plenty more hidden stories waiting for you, stories of courage, of innovation, and of the men and women who shaped history. Until next time, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.